Hello everyone, welcome to Sleepless Timelines. Today we are diving into a history that never happened, or at least one that might have unfolded very differently. Whether you're here out of curiosity, love history, or just need something interesting to listen to, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. It really helps me keep making videos like this, exploring alternate histories and what-if scenarios that let us imagine how the world could have been. So now, what if Constantinople never fell? What if the walls of that fabled city, the jewel of Byzantium, had withstood the siege of 1453 and the Ottoman Empire never claimed it as their own? It's a question that reshapes not just a single city, but the trajectory of empires, religions, and cultures across Europe and Asia. Imagine a world where Constantinople remained the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. Its towering walls, formidable and impregnable, would continue to guard the Bosphorus, holding back Ottoman expansion and keeping the Mediterranean's eastern trade firmly in Christian hands. The Renaissance, fueled in part by scholars fleeing a collapsing Byzantium, might have taken a different path, or perhaps arrived later, or in a more concentrated form within the city itself. The diffusion of Greek philosophy, classical texts, and knowledge preserved in Byzantine libraries could have stayed centered in Constantinople, making it not only a military and political stronghold but a beacon of learning unparalleled in the known world. Politically, Europe would have faced a very different set of pressures. Without the Ottomans controlling Constantinople, the balance of power in Eastern Europe would have shifted dramatically. Venice and Genoa might have maintained tighter control over trade routes, while Russia's ambitions to claim itself as the Third Rome might have been stifled or delayed by the continued presence of a strong, vibrant Byzantine state. And the papacy? The ongoing threat from the East might have shifted Western European alliances in ways that would be almost unrecognizable to us. Perhaps the Habsburgs would not have had to contend with the Ottoman push into Hungary, or maybe other empires would have risen to fill the void, creating an entirely different patchwork of power across the continent. Culturally, the world would be equally transformed. Constantinople was a city where East met West, where Greek, Roman, and Christian traditions intertwined with trade and ideas from the wider Mediterranean. Its survival would have meant centuries more of this cross-cultural ferment, influencing architecture, art, religion, and language. The Orthodox Church, too, would remain a central force in global Christianity, potentially reshaping theological and political debates for centuries to come. So, buckle up, because today we're going to explore an alternate history in which Constantinople never fell, examining the political, economic, and cultural ripples that might have spread across the globe. From trade and warfare to religion and science, we'll imagine a world shaped not by Ottoman conquest, but by the enduring might of Byzantium. Now, let's turn to the economic consequences of a Byzantine survival. Constantinople was more than just a city. It was the linchpin of trade between Europe and Asia. Its ports and marketplaces hummed with merchants from Venice to Alexandria, exchanging spices, silks, gold, and rare goods. The city's strategic location on the Bosphorus allowed it to control the maritime gateway between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, giving Byzantium immense leverage over trade routes that stretched across continents. If the Ottomans had been kept at bay in 1453, these trade networks would have remained firmly under Byzantine control, reshaping the flow of wealth and commodities across the known world. European merchants might have continued relying on Constantinople as the hub for luxury goods, precious metals, and Eastern imports, potentially delaying the maritime expeditions that ultimately defined the Age of Discovery. The urgency that spurred explorers like Columbus and Vasco da Gama, finding routes around Africa to bypass Ottoman-controlled lands, might have been far less pressing. In this scenario, the Americas could have remained largely untouched by European powers for decades or even centuries, fundamentally altering the timeline of global colonization. The economic implications go deeper. A surviving Byzantium would have maintained and possibly expanded its sophisticated system of taxation, banking, and commerce. Gold coinage from Constantinople was recognized across Europe and the Middle East, and the city's markets could have continued to attract artisans, traders, and financiers from across the Mediterranean. A wealthier, more stable Byzantium might have fostered innovation in finance and industry much earlier than occurred in our timeline, creating economic hubs rivaling Venice, Florence, or Genoa. Without the fall of Constantinople, the Italian maritime republics would have faced stiffer competition, potentially reshaping European commerce. The pressure on Venice and Genoa to dominate trade might have been alleviated, allowing these city-states to diversify or focus more on cultural and intellectual pursuits rather than territorial expansion. Cities that later rose in the shadow of Ottoman conquest, Belgrade, Sofia, even Istanbul as it became under Ottoman rule, may have remained minor players, with Constantinople continuing to dominate politically, economically, and culturally in the Eastern Mediterranean. Military history, too, would have looked profoundly different. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was not just the end of a city, but a pivot point that allowed the Ottomans to expand into the Balkans and Central Europe. Denied the jewel of the Bosphorus, the Ottomans would have been forced to redirect their expansion northward or eastward, perhaps clashing more frequently with Persia or moving into the steppes of Central Asia. The famed Janissaries, created in response to the conquest of Constantinople, may never have existed in their historical form, altering the trajectory of military organization and tactics in both the Ottoman Empire and Europe. And without the fall of the city as a rallying cry for Christendom, European alliances might have formed differently. Wars, treaties, and territorial ambitions would have followed a very different rhythm. Hungary, Poland, and the emerging states of Eastern Europe might have had a more stable frontier, avoiding decades of conflict with Ottoman forces and allowing political structures to develop along alternative paths. The absence of a dominant Ottoman power in southeastern Europe could have dramatically reshaped the map of the continent. On the intellectual front, the survival of Byzantium would have made Constantinople an unparalleled center of learning. Its libraries and academies could have rivaled Florence or Paris, hosting scholars and philosophers from across the Mediterranean. The westward migration of Greek scholars, which fueled the Renaissance in Italy, may have occurred differently, or been far less pronounced, if Constantinople itself remained a thriving intellectual hub. Classical texts, preserved over centuries within Byzantine walls, could have continued to influence education, philosophy, and science from within the city rather than dispersing westward. A Byzantine intellectual renaissance, blending Greek, Roman, Christian, and Islamic knowledge, might have created a unique culture of scholarship that challenged Western European dominance in fields like astronomy, medicine, engineering, and mathematics. Knowledge might have developed under different paradigms, leading to alternative technological innovations and scientific revolutions. Imagine medical practices, engineering techniques, or philosophical ideas emerging centuries earlier or in entirely different directions because Constantinople remained a living repository of classical and contemporary knowledge. Beyond politics, economics, and intellectual life, the cultural and social ramifications would have been just as significant. Constantinople was a city of immense diversity, where Greek, Roman, Christian, and Eastern traditions intersected. Its architecture, art, and daily life were shaped by centuries of synthesis, and this unique culture could have continued to evolve uninterrupted. The Orthodox Church, headquartered in Constantinople, would have remained a dominant force in global Christianity, influencing theological debates, liturgical practices, and political alignments. Religious disputes that later reshaped Europe and the Near East, such as the rise of Protestantism, the Catholic Counter-Reformation, or Orthodox Catholic tensions, might have played out differently in a world where the Byzantine state remained strong and intact. The city itself would have served as a cultural bridge, continuing to transmit ideas between East and West, potentially fostering even more sophisticated artistic. In short, the survival of Constantinople would have reshaped the world on multiple levels. It would have influenced global trade, delayed or redirected exploration, altered military history, and created a unique intellectual and cultural hub that rivaled any European city. The geopolitical map of Europe and the Near East would have been fundamentally different, with the Ottoman Empire either delayed, weakened, or entirely redirected. Even science, philosophy, and art might have followed alternate trajectories, shaped by a Byzantine city that never fell, a city whose influence reached far beyond its walls. This is what makes this what-if scenario so compelling. A single city, holding its walls just a little longer, could have changed the fate of empires, religions, trade networks, and cultures, echoing across centuries in ways that are almost impossible to fully grasp. The ripple effects would have been felt from the shores of the Mediterranean to the heart of Europe, from the marketplaces of Asia Minor to the universities of Italy and beyond. Now, let's imagine the broader geopolitical consequences of a surviving Byzantium. With Constantinople intact, the Ottoman Empire, as we know it, may have struggled to consolidate power in Anatolia and the Balkans. Without the jewel of the Bosphorus in their hands, the Ottomans would have faced significant logistical and strategic limitations. Expansion into Eastern Europe might have been delayed or possibly stymied altogether. Hungary, Serbia, and Bulgaria could have maintained stronger sovereignty, perhaps forming a defensive coalition around Byzantium itself. The historical narrative of Ottoman dominance in southeastern Europe would have been rewritten entirely. Instead of a sweeping empire stretching across 3 continents, we may have seen a patchwork of smaller states, competing for influence while using Constantinople as a buffer and, potentially, a hub of diplomacy. The presence of a thriving Byzantine state would also have profound implications for Russia. Historically, the fall of Constantinople helped frame Moscow's claim as the Third Rome, positioning itself as the defender of Orthodox Christianity. But if Constantinople had survived, this ideological mantle may never have been fully adopted. Russian princes might have remained regionally influential but lacking the spiritual legitimacy and symbolic weight that came from assuming the legacy of Byzantium. Consequently, the trajectory of Russian expansion could have been slower, and the political structure of Eastern Europe might have remained more fragmented for centuries. Moscow would not have risen so quickly as a unifying power, and its conflicts with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Teutonic Knights, or even the Ottomans might have looked very different. The balance of power in the region could have favored smaller states that banded together under Byzantine leadership, producing a more multipolar Eastern Europe rather than the eventual dominance of a single, sprawling empire. Trade would have been another major area of divergence. Constantinople's strategic location at the crossroads of Europe and Asia meant that its survival would have preserved vital overland trade routes long before European exploration redirected the flow of goods around Africa. Venetian and Genoese merchants, rather than relying solely on maritime routes around the Mediterranean, could have continued to operate in partnership with Byzantine authorities, exchanging silks, spices, and other commodities along more secure, overland pathways. This might have reduced the urgency of the Portuguese and Spanish voyages to Africa and the Americas, potentially delaying, or at least reshaping, the European age of exploration. A surviving Byzantium could have acted as a trade regulator, collecting tolls, standardizing commerce, and even sponsoring scientific and navigational advancements to improve transportation within its sphere of influence. The economic development of Western Europe might have followed a different path, with wealth concentrated in Mediterranean hubs rather than being driven outward to the Atlantic powers. Cultural consequences would have been just as profound. The Renaissance, which historically benefited from the influx of Greek scholars fleeing Byzantium, may have taken on a different character. Instead of dispersing knowledge westward, the classical texts and philosophical ideas might have remained centered in Constantinople, fostering a uniquely Eastern Mediterranean Renaissance. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Paris may have still experienced intellectual revival, but it might have been slower or less radical, influenced by Byzantine rather than Roman or Greek frameworks filtered through Italian humanists. Imagine a world where Byzantine architects, mathematicians, and philosophers were the primary drivers of European thought, shaping universities, libraries, and art forms in ways that Western Europe never fully achieved on its own. Religiously, the survival of Constantinople would have maintained the Orthodox Church as a central authority, shaping Christian practice across the Mediterranean and into Eastern Europe. Without the dramatic fall to the Ottomans galvanizing Western Christendom, the Catholic Church might have found itself negotiating with a strong, independent Orthodox state instead of facing a continent under Ottoman threat. Theological disputes, councils, and political marriages would have unfolded under different pressures, potentially preventing or delaying some of the major conflicts between East and West. Monastic traditions, pilgrimage routes, and ecclesiastical hierarchies may have remained centered in Constantinople, preserving centuries of scholarship and religious practices that were disrupted by the city's fall in 1453. Orthodox Christianity could have maintained a more cohesive and authoritative presence in Europe and Asia, influencing everything from liturgy and iconography to law and education. Even the sciences could have been profoundly affected. Constantinople had been a repository of knowledge from the ancient world, Greek mathematics, Roman engineering, astronomical records, and medical texts. The fall of the city dispersed these resources to Italy and beyond, but if the city had remained intact, Byzantine scholars could have continued to advance science from within the city itself. Engineering projects like bridges, aqueducts, and fortifications may have evolved faster. Navigation and cartography might have advanced along different lines, as the Byzantines sought to protect and enhance trade routes. Even medicine could have progressed along a more centralized path, with Constantinople's hospitals and universities training doctors and transmitting knowledge to Europe and Asia in a steady stream rather than a trickle following mass migration. Social and urban life would also look different. Constantinople, had it survived, would have continued to attract migrants, traders, artisans, and scholars from across the Mediterranean and the Near East. Its cosmopolitan character might have intensified, creating a multicultural hub where Greek, Latin, Arabic, Armenian, and Slavic languages mingled. The arts, music, and cuisine would reflect this melting pot, producing innovations that might later influence Europe in subtle, pervasive ways. Perhaps painting styles, mosaics, or even musical traditions would have evolved differently, blending Eastern and Western influences in forms never seen in our history. Public spaces, markets, and theaters could have set standards for urban design, inspiring other cities to emulate Byzantine planning and aesthetics. Finally, the long-term implications for global history are staggering to consider. Without the Ottoman conquest, the balance of power in the Middle East and Eastern Europe would have shifted, potentially affecting the rise of the Safavids, the Mughals, and even European colonial empires. Wars that shaped continents, the sieges of Vienna, the Balkan uprisings, the Crusades' echoes, may have either not occurred or unfolded in entirely different ways. And the cultural and intellectual legacies that traveled westward in the wake of Constantinople's fall, printing, mathematics, and humanism, could have remained tightly centered in the East, shaping the trajectory of the modern world in subtle but profound ways. In imagining a Constantinople that never fell, we are not simply considering an isolated city surviving a siege. We are exploring a world in which the flow of knowledge, the rise of empires, the spread of religions, and the patterns of trade and culture are dramatically altered. The survival of Byzantium would have created centuries of continuity in governance, scholarship, and faith, with effects that would ripple across the globe, shaping a Europe and Asia and a Middle East that are both familiar and alien to us. In this alternate history, Constantinople remains not just a city but a keystone of civilization, a center of power and learning whose influence never waned, whose walls never fell, and whose legacy would define the contours of a very different world. If Constantinople had survived, the effects on technology, military strength, and science could have been remarkable, and not just for the city itself. For centuries, Byzantium had been a center for practical knowledge and clever engineering. Its walls, aqueducts, and massive buildings weren't just impressive, they were lessons in construction, defense, and urban planning. If the city had remained unconquered, these skills would have been refined and shared over time, creating a culture of innovation that could outpace much of Europe. Military engineers might have invented better cannons, stronger ships, or new forms of fortification decades earlier. Naval technology could have progressed faster too. Byzantium controlled the Bosphorus, the gateway between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, meaning its fleets could dominate the waters while experimenting with ship design, signaling, and navigation. A stronger Byzantine navy could have shaped trade and politics for generations, influencing distant states from Venice to Alexandria. Science and mathematics would have grown in parallel. Constantinople had libraries full of Greek, Roman, and Middle Eastern knowledge, making it a hub for scholars. If the city had remained stable, those texts could have been studied, copied, and improved on, creating new discoveries centuries earlier. Astronomy, medicine, and engineering would likely have progressed faster. Imagine doctors experimenting with treatments, engineers building more ambitious bridges or aqueducts, or mapmakers charting seas more accurately, all happening under the watchful support of a stable Byzantine state. Innovations could have spread not just locally, but across Europe and Asia. The city could have attracted thinkers from Venice, Cairo, or Baghdad, turning Constantinople into a center of global learning long before the scientific revolution began in our timeline. This technological and scientific growth would also shape the wider world. A strong Byzantium controlling trade routes could have delayed European exploration by sea, keeping merchants reliant on overland and Mediterranean trade. The urgency that drove Portuguese and Spanish voyages around Africa might not have existed, or it might have taken a different form. The Americas could have been discovered later or under different circumstances, possibly by a coalition of Mediterranean powers rather than Atlantic explorers alone. The timing and method of colonization, the spread of crops, animals, and ideas might have been altered entirely, creating a different balance of global influence centuries before modern empires rose. Militarily, the survival of Constantinople would have slowed or even blocked Ottoman expansion into Eastern Europe. States like Hungary, Serbia, and Bulgaria might have stayed independent for longer, creating a buffer zone that would reduce conflict across the Balkans. The Ottomans would have had to look elsewhere to grow their empire, possibly turning east into Anatolia or Persia, or north into the steppes. Without the fall of the city to rally Christian Europe, alliances and wars might have formed differently, with Byzantine diplomacy playing a central role. Military innovations might have spread from Byzantium, influencing armies across Europe, the Middle East, and even North Africa. Culturally, the impact would be just as strong. Constantinople was a city where East met West, blending Greek, Roman, Christian, and Middle Eastern traditions. Its survival would have allowed this mix to continue uninterrupted, influencing art, architecture, language, and music. The Orthodox Church would have remained a dominant religious authority, shaping European Christianity and possibly even easing tensions with the Catholic West. This technological and scientific growth would also shape the wider world. A strong Byzantium controlling trade routes could have delayed European exploration by sea, keeping merchants reliant on overland and Mediterranean trade. The urgency that drove Portuguese and Spanish voyages around Africa might not have existed, or it might have taken a different form. The Americas could have been discovered later or under different circumstances, possibly by a coalition of Mediterranean powers rather than Atlantic explorers alone. The timing and method of colonization, the spread of crops, animals, and ideas might have been altered entirely, creating a different balance of global influence centuries before modern empires rose. Militarily, the survival of Constantinople would have slowed or even blocked Ottoman expansion into Eastern Europe. States like Hungary, Serbia, and Bulgaria might have stayed independent for longer, creating a buffer zone that would reduce conflict across the Balkans. The Ottomans would have had to look elsewhere to grow their empire, possibly turning east into Anatolia or Persia, or north into the steppes. Without the fall of the city to rally Christian Europe, alliances and wars might have formed differently, with Byzantine diplomacy playing a central role. Military innovations might have spread from Byzantium, influencing armies across Europe, the Middle East, and even North Africa. Culturally, the impact would be just as strong. Constantinople was a city where East met West, blending Greek, Roman, Christian, and Middle Eastern traditions. Its survival would have allowed this mix to continue uninterrupted, influencing art, architecture, language, and music. The Orthodox Church would have remained a dominant religious authority, shaping European Christianity and possibly even easing tensions with the Catholic West. Looking further into the future, a surviving Byzantium could have affected the early modern world in major ways. Its focus on trade, science, and urban planning might have inspired similar hubs across the Mediterranean and beyond. Cities like Venice or Alexandria could have worked in partnership rather than competition, creating a cooperative Mediterranean network. Innovations in navigation and trade could have spread earlier, affecting how Europe connected with Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Even European industrial development might have taken a different path, with ideas for machines, roads, and public works emerging from Byzantine influence rather than being rediscovered later in Western Europe. The speed of technological change could have increased dramatically, and the balance of power between East and West might have shifted in ways that seem almost impossible from our historical viewpoint. Education and scholarship would have played a crucial role in this alternate future. A thriving Byzantium could have hosted academies, libraries, and observatories, attracting students and scholars from far and wide. Knowledge that in our timeline scattered across Europe might have stayed concentrated, creating long-lasting schools of thought in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Future scientific revolutions, such as the development of modern physics or chemistry, might have had their roots in Constantinople centuries earlier. Medicine could have advanced more quickly, perhaps preventing some diseases or improving sanitation long before it became a priority in Western Europe. Engineering and architecture could have transformed cities worldwide, spreading urban planning techniques that emphasized public works, efficient roads, and resilient infrastructure. Trade and economics would have followed a new trajectory as well. A Byzantine-controlled Mediterranean would have concentrated wealth in the east, influencing which regions developed fastest. Western Europe might have had to adapt differently, possibly focusing less on Atlantic exploration and more on overland and Mediterranean commerce. This shift could have delayed the rise of Atlantic powers like Spain, Portugal, and later Britain, creating a more multipolar world centuries before the Age of Empires as we know it. Banking, markets, and trade networks might have spread eastward, connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa through Constantinople as the central hub of global commerce. Even social life and culture would have evolved along different lines. Constantinople's mix of languages, traditions, and religions would have influenced art, music, literature, and cuisine far beyond its walls. Trade and scholarship would bring people together, fostering a cosmopolitan culture that could inspire cities throughout Europe and Asia. Philosophical ideas might have traveled differently, combining Eastern and Western thought in ways that reshape moral, political, and scientific ideas across continents. Public spaces, civic infrastructure, and urban planning could have set models that other cities sought to copy, spreading Byzantine influence into new parts of the world. Finally, the long-term consequences are staggering to imagine. Without Constantinople's fall, the Ottoman Empire as we know it might never have reached the size or power it did. Russia might not have claimed the Third Rome, leaving Eastern Europe more fragmented and multipolar. European colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Asia could have been delayed or conducted differently, changing the spread of technology, religion, and culture. Let's step forward in time almost 6 centuries ahead, to 2026, in a world where Constantinople never fell. Before we dive in, it's important to note that this is a theoretical scenario, an alternate timeline built on plausible historical divergence. Small shifts in the past, the survival of a single city, can cascade across centuries, affecting politics, trade, religion, and culture on a global scale. So while the world we're about to explore is fictional, it's rooted in the consequences of Byzantium's continued existence, extrapolated logically from historical trends. In 2026, Constantinople remains the beating heart of a modern Byzantine state, a sprawling metropolis straddling Europe and Asia, where the Bosphorus still serves as the vital artery of trade and diplomacy. The city itself has grown far beyond the walls imagined in 1453, yet the architectural legacy of the Byzantines is unmistakable. Domes, aqueducts, and mosaics punctuate the skyline, harmoniously integrated with modern skyscrapers, high-speed rail hubs, and bustling seaports. Byzantine governance has adapted to the modern era, evolving into a complex parliamentary system that blends centralized imperial tradition with representative institutions. Unlike many modern states, Byzantium's continuity has provided extraordinary stability. Centuries of uninterrupted administration, law, and education have cultivated a society that prizes scholarly achievement, civic participation, and technological innovation. Politically, the world map looks very different. The Ottoman Empire, having been denied Constantinople, never achieved its historical dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, and its territories remained fragmented. Modern Turkey exists, but as a collection of smaller republics with regional autonomy rather than a single unified state. Eastern Europe is similarly decentralized, with Hungary, Bulgaria, Serbia, and the Balkans maintaining a more multipolar balance of power under the diplomatic shadow of Byzantium. Russia, lacking the symbolic mantle of the Third Rome, developed more gradually. Its influence in Eastern Europe is present but muted, with the Orthodox Church's authority firmly centered in Constantinople rather than Moscow. This has created a world where power is more evenly distributed, with no single dominant superpower and a stronger role for historical trading cities as diplomatic and economic hubs. Economically, the impact of a surviving Byzantium is profound. The city has maintained its historical role as a crossroads of commerce, now expanded into global networks connecting Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Trade routes through the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and beyond remain robust and highly regulated under Byzantine oversight. Instead of European colonial empires exploiting distant continents as we know them, Byzantium played a central role in sponsoring exploration, infrastructure, and trade partnerships. Modern shipping lanes, ports, and logistics networks in Africa and South Asia often trace their roots back to Byzantine-led trade agreements centuries earlier. Financial innovation, banking, and currency standards emerged under Byzantine influence, resulting in a more interconnected global economy with alternative centers of wealth beyond Western Europe. Cities such as Alexandria, Venice, and Constantinople itself operate as financial and industrial hubs, rivaling, or in some cases exceeding, the influence of New York, London, and Shanghai in our timeline. Culturally, the world has been shaped profoundly by a living Byzantine tradition. Orthodox Christianity continues as a dominant global faith, but it has absorbed centuries of cross-cultural exchange, resulting in a less rigid division between East and West. Byzantine education, art, and philosophy influence global curricula. Classical Greek and Roman texts have remained in the city's libraries for centuries, creating a continuous lineage of scholarship that blends with scientific and technological education. Art and architecture across Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East retain Byzantine elements. Mosaics, dome structures, and intricate iconography are common, and the fusion of classical and modern design is celebrated in public spaces. Even popular culture reflects these shifts. Literature, cinema, and music often draw inspiration from Byzantine history, philosophy, and aesthetics, giving global media a distinctive flavor markedly different from our timeline. Technologically, the uninterrupted flow of knowledge from Constantinople has produced a world that is both familiar and surprisingly advanced in some areas. Engineering feats, bridges, aqueducts, naval vessels were developed centuries earlier, and centralized support for scientific research has accelerated innovation. Medicine, astronomy, and mathematics in the modern era benefit from an unbroken scholarly tradition tracing back to antiquity. Space exploration exists, but priorities are slightly different. Rather than the mid-20th century space race dominated by American and Soviet competition, Byzantium invested heavily in cooperative exploration and communications, leading to advanced satellite networks and early experiments in orbital manufacturing decades earlier than in our timeline. Even renewable energy and environmental management have a different trajectory. Centuries of centralized administration, maritime commerce, and urban planning fostered early attention to resource management and sustainable infrastructure, particularly in Mediterranean port cities. On a social level, Constantinople remains cosmopolitan in a way few modern cities match. Arabic, Greek, Latin, Armenian, Slavic, and Turkic languages intermingle in neighborhoods, universities, and marketplaces. Immigration has been historically normalized, as merchants, scholars, and artisans moved freely within Byzantine-controlled territories for centuries, creating a global model of cultural exchange. Social institutions, education, healthcare, and governance are designed around centuries of experience managing diversity, producing relatively cohesive societies compared to fragmented nation-states elsewhere. The city's population exceeds 20 million, yet urban planning, public transportation, and governance allow it to function efficiently. Byzantine law, while modernized, retains principles developed over centuries, emphasizing civic duty, intellectual merit, and commercial responsibility. Internationally, Byzantium in 2026 serves as a unique mediating power. Its centuries of diplomatic experience allow it to broker conflicts in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Global institutions are shaped by Byzantine models of council governance and trade regulation, rather than the post-World War II frameworks we know today. The United Nations exists in some form, but its structure, rules, and influence have been modeled on Byzantine precedent. Dispute resolution often relies on centuries-old traditions of arbitration, weighted councils, and long-term strategic planning, giving Byzantium a level of authority and respect unmatched by other modern states. In this timeline, the Byzantine economy is heavily involved in innovation-driven industries. Cultural influence remains immense. Byzantine literature, music, and visual arts enjoy a global audience, and centuries of preserved knowledge ensure that classical education maintains prestige worldwide. Philosophical traditions from Byzantium are taught alongside, or in some cases instead of, Western European paradigms, creating a more pluralistic global intellectual culture. Art, architecture, and music emphasize synthesis rather than divergence. Byzantine influence can be traced in buildings, concert halls, and universities from Cairo to Vienna, and even in North American institutions that adopted Mediterranean-inspired planning and scholarship. Religion, too, plays a distinctive role. The Orthodox Church maintains central authority, but has evolved into a global network that emphasizes tolerance and intercultural dialogue. Religious conflicts, while not absent, are less widespread and often mediated directly by Byzantine diplomats. Pilgrimage, theological debate, and scholarly exchange continue to flow through Constantinople, keeping the city at the center of spiritual life across Europe and the Near East. By contrast, the Catholic Church, Protestant denominations, and other faiths have developed in dialogue with a strong Byzantine presence, rather than in opposition to a rising Ottoman Empire, leading to more cooperative theological and political relationships. Even geopolitically, Byzantium's survival has reshaped the world order. The Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa all contain smaller, more autonomous states that trade extensively with Byzantium. Colonial ventures, if they occur, are often sponsored in partnership with Byzantine merchants and administrators rather than undertaken solely by European powers. Wars over resources, territory, and religion are mediated through complex diplomatic networks, reducing large-scale conflict and fostering cooperative technological development. Global urban planning and infrastructure projects, bridges, ports, canals, often follow Byzantine standards and engineering principles, emphasizing efficiency, longevity, and interconnectedness. By 2026, the world in which Constantinople never fell is markedly different yet recognizably modern. Trade, diplomacy, education, and culture have been guided for centuries by the influence of a single, enduring city. Empires rise and fall, but the presence of Byzantium ensures a continuity of knowledge, law, and innovation that shapes every corner of human society. The ripple effects of a city that never fell continue to touch politics, economics, and culture on a global scale, illustrating the profound consequences of a single historical divergence. Looking back at this alternate timeline, it's clear that the survival of Constantinople would have reshaped the world in ways that are both profound and far-reaching. From the bustling streets of a modern Byzantine metropolis to the corridors of global diplomacy, trade, and intellectual life, the ripples of a city that never fell continue to define political power, cultural development, and technological progress. A thriving Byzantium in 2026 serves as a testament to centuries of continuity, showing how the decisions of the past, or the walls that held a city, can echo through time, influencing empires, economies, and societies across the globe. We've explored a world where the Renaissance took a different path, trade and exploration evolved under Byzantine guidance, and global culture and education remained intertwined with centuries-old traditions. We've imagined how power in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia would be distributed, how Orthodox Christianity maintained its influence, and how science, technology, and urban development followed a trajectory shaped by a city that continued to flourish uninterrupted. From diplomacy and conflict mediation to engineering, medicine, and the arts, the consequences of Constantinople's survival paint a picture of a world that is both familiar and strikingly different from our own. Ultimately, this what-if scenario reminds us that history is fragile and contingent. A single siege, a single city, or a single decision can alter the course of human events across centuries. Thinking through these alternate timelines not only sparks our imagination but also gives perspective on the forces that shaped our own reality. Thank you for watching all the way through this deep dive into a world where Constantinople never fell. If you made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and drop a like. It really helps support the content and lets me know you enjoy exploring these alternate histories. And as always, stay curious, because the past, and its many possible futures, is far more fascinating than it often seems. After all, who knows what could happen when we ask the question, what if?